It's that time again. The annual conference of the American Society of Ag Consultants, otherwise known as ASAC, is going to be held in Fort Myers, Florida, this November 4th and 5th. Kurt Covington is one of 9 professionals who will address the conference. The other speakers who will cover a wide range of topics represent Florida Farm Bureau, Florida Citrus Commission, University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, National Ag Law Center, Risk Mitigators and Advisors, Tyler Associates, as well as the lead economist for dairy at CoBank, and myself, Chrissy Wozniak from North American Ag. The day and a half of presentations will be followed by ag tours on Tuesday afternoon at Echo Farms, one of my favorite places here in Fort Myers. Attendees will experience farming at its most creative, with unique demonstrations, plants, and techniques being used to help farmers and urban gardeners in developing countries. A second tour at Echo will showcase simple technologies that can improve food, water, and shelter for millions of people. A third tour of a hydroponic grower is also being planned. For more information and to register, visit www.agconsultants.org. That's www.agconsultants.org. See you there. Finding alternative ways to fund small farms and agriculture businesses can be a challenge in today's marketplace. Likewise, finding ways for the public to invest in agriculture while supporting local business isn't easy. NetGreen.com was created to fulfill both of these needs. NetGreen Capital provides a marketplace of investments for both accredited and non-accredited investors to invest directly into local farms and businesses. NetGreen Capital's revenue-based notes allow farmers and business owners the opportunity to raise the funds they need without collateral, without giving up equity in their business, and with comparable industry interest rates. For investors looking to make an impact, it offers the opportunity to invest in farms and agribusiness within their local community. Find out why NetGreen Capital is the leading crowdfunding and impact investment platform for farms and agribusiness at www.netgreen.com. That's www.netgreen.com. Hi, and welcome to North American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. This week is a little different. Last week, I attended the 2024 American Agri-women Fly-In in Washington, D.C. Among the many speakers that we heard from there was retired University of Delaware professor David Legates. His presentation was recorded. The audio isn't perfect, but his content is thought-provoking and it's important. It flies against the grain of current ideology. From the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, David Legates' presentation was titled, "How Will Climate Change Affect Agriculture?" He did a deep dive into real climate data and how environmental extremism is causing problems for the American farmer and overall global food security. Legates has testified 3 times as an expert witness before the U.S. Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works and before both Pennsylvania House and Senate Committee meetings on climate change. He participated in the historic joint USA-USSR protocol for the exchange of climate information in 1990, won the 2002 Boeing Autometric Award for the best paper in image analysis and interpretation by the American Society of Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. He won first place in the International Statistical Institute and ESRI Paper Competition in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and was awarded the Courage in Defense of Science Award in 2015. So please forgive the audio quality and enjoy this presentation.
So, thank you very much. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. I must confess that I originally was very hesitant at speaking in this group because I thought she said this was a meeting of the American Agri-women Association. But I have a feeling by the time the talk is over, you probably should be angry women, particularly angry at how climate change is going to affect agriculture. When we talk about climate change, let's see if I can get some of the lights down here a little bit.
David, is your lapel on?
It should be on.
Okay, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, he said this would probably, what am I doing? There are a light switch somewhere, there we go. Yeah, just the ones up front. Yeah, there we go, it's a little bit better. When we start talking about climate change, one of the things we always focus on are what we call greenhouse gases. And in particular, we're interested in carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, how they're changing. We always forget, though, the most important greenhouse gas, which is water vapor. And the reason we often forget it is because I was in a Senate hearing once when the climatologist sitting next to me was asked by Senator Ritter, who asked him the question, why are we worried so much about carbon dioxide and not about water vapor? And I expected all these potentially scientific answers, but the answer he gave was because we can't regulate it. And so there's a lot of interest in regulating carbon dioxide and the other, what we also call trace gases, particularly because you'll notice, do I have a pointer here? I do. I have lots of things here. Let's see, if I can put the pointer without, there we go. You'll notice we call them trace gases because they don't constitute much of the atmosphere. And the question is always, why do we worry about these trace gases when in particular other gases such as nitrogen, oxygen, and argon together make up about 99% of the atmosphere, but you never hear about them? And the answer is simply because they can't dance. What happens is that carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide have the ability to do these 6 types of things. Actually, methane can do lots more. Those types of motions absorb energy in the thermal infrared radiation, and that's what we refer to as heat. So the ones on the top will absorb energy, heat energy, leaving the Earth's atmosphere. Nitrogen, oxygen, argon, even if they cover 99% of the atmosphere, they do not absorb any of the energy. And everybody's interested in climate change. Here's a pharmaceutical company. They are interested in fighting climate change. And one of the things they said is, this is why Bayer is devoted to decarbonizing agriculture. I thought, how are we going to get carbon out of agriculture? Is this like the old days where we came up with carbon-free sugar? Obviously, we're not removing carbon from sugar or carbon from agriculture. That's not really what they mean. And we could go back to dehydrated water that we had in the 40s. But the idea is somehow that carbon dioxide, methane, both of which contain carbon, are bad and evil gases. And what we're trying to do is essentially stop them from happening. So first of all, what I want to start with is, what is the debate? In particular, on what can we agree? So where do we have common ground? And then we can talk about those differences. The first thing we can say is that our climate is changing because it always has changed. Climate change is not a hoax. Climate change has always happened, always will happen. The problem is we got into defining climate as average weather. And climate is simply much more than average weather. If it were nothing more than average weather, then we'd be interested in the mean, the variation, the maximum, the minimum, and it should remain constant, and if it doesn't remain constant, something's gone horribly wrong. But in fact, we know that climate is all very dynamic, it's variable, it's ever changing. Not every year looks like the other year, and some of that is driven by background changes in climate. So climate changes. The second thing we recognize is that humans can and do influence the climate. One of the things you would note that if you look at any major city on a night when there's really nothing going on in terms of weather, if you look at the weather reports, you'll see generally the warmest temperatures are in the center city, and as you get away from center city, the temperatures generally decrease. We can see this again here in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, right around this area. You can see lots of variability, and I won't call these hinterlands because they're still urbanized, suburbanized areas, but you can see high temperatures right here in center city of both, and it decreases as you go out from the center. The third thing we can say is that carbon dioxide and others trace gases have generally increased, and that's largely due to human activity. So if we look from the Mauna Loa Observatory where we measure this, you can see the sawtooth curve. This is essentially the seasonal cycle, the carbon dioxide going up over time. And generally what we're trying to correlate is this increase in carbon dioxide to an increase in something related to climate. Temperature, precipitation, storminess, something along those lines. So we're always looking for either an increase or a decrease that might be connected to this increasing line. So that's what we're going to look for as we go along. Now you got to be careful because this looks like we went from virtually nothing to quite a bit, But the answer is we didn't start at 0. And if I show you starting at 0, this is the same curve, you can see there's almost no change whatsoever. The change in the last 250 years has been about 1/100th of 1%. That's the equivalent of about 1 penny out of $100. There's not much change in carbon dioxide. The question is that change significant enough to change our climate? And that's what we want to investigate. Fourth, globally, air temperature has risen over the past half century. We can see in this case, I'm going to use a satellite record. We'll talk about the surface record in a minute. But the satellite record does show a warming since 1980, when we first had satellites to measure this kind of stuff. Beginning in 79, you can see it went from about minus 0.3 to about plus 0.3. So we've had a warming of about 0.6 degrees Celsius, some close to 1 degree Fahrenheit. There we go. So the real climate change debate is, to what extent are humans responsible for the recent climate change we see? What are the future consequences associated with climate change, both natural and human-induced? And what should our response strategies be? And I'm going to argue that a well-informed and prudent response is always the only course of action to take. Now, at the Trump administration, we were putting together the 5th assessment of the National Climate Assessment. It got taken over by the next administration, and it changed its tone quite a bit. But this is a section on agriculture, food systems, and rural communities. And if you look at what it says climate change, especially shifts in precipitation, air temperature, soil moisture, is disrupting agricultural production and food systems. The word "is" implies it's happening, right now. A changing climate characterized by more frequent and severe extremes, such as heat waves, droughts, and extreme rainfall, will affect U.S. agriculture. So it's going to happen today, it's happening today, and it will happen in the future. So let's look at these, particularly with respect to trying to figure out how these variables are changing, and if they're changing consistently with what we would expect to happen with our rising carbon dioxide. So let's start with the simplest one, air temperature. I want to go back here, because one of the things we often focus on are our surface observations. Back up until 1940, we generally had our surface observations located in the downtown area. Then along came these fly-in Ginnies, and we realized that to put in airplanes, you need lots of land to take off and land. You need lots of land in particular so that we can measure wind speed, air temperature, and so forth, where they're landing. So, for example, Dulles Airport was located way outside of town, which was in a rural area. If you look at some of the early pictures of Dulles, you can see farm animals grazing. Well, that doesn't happen anymore because the urban sprawl has essentially incorporated Dulles. But what happened, therefore, is we took it from the warm center city, moved it out to cheap land outside of town, where it was outside the urban heat island, and then in places like Washington, D.C., Baltimore, with what used to be Friendship International Airport, now is BWI, Baltimore Washington International, not George Thurgood, sorry, wrong Thurgood, Thurgood Marshall, sorry, Thurgood Marshall Airport. Down here, you can see that we changed the characteristic. So in particular, the temperatures dropped and then rose again. And in fact, this is one of the things that a lot of people see. I mean, here, for example, is a station that hasn't moved. It's in Phoenix. And now what you're really measuring is not what's going on regionally. You're measuring the temperature literally over this parking lot. And so there's a lot of problems associated with our observational networks. They move, they change instrumentation, big problems that we'll see coming up. So one of the things that Willie Soon and a couple colleagues and I did is to look at observed temperature, this is rural and urban, and to separate just rural stations out. And so one of the things we saw is that there's a warming up until about the 1940s. There's a little bit of cooling that takes place, and then warming again from about 1980 on. I got involved in this in the late 1970s, and if you're that old, you will remember that the big concern was global cooling. That if left to its own device, what happened is we're going to be in the next ice age shortly, and of course that turned over, and so did the concern for now global warming. But you can see this curve is dramatically different than this curve, because the two curves are related in this case, to the fact that one has an urban heat island effect built in and the other one doesn't. Now, what we'd like to have are stations which are associated with the same location, stations that have the same instrumentation, and effectively have not had an urbanization effect. NOAA keeps track of these, and they're called the Historical Climate Network stations. And so here's mean temperature for a number of them around the United States. And you can see if we go back to 1990, you can see that there's lots of variability, but no long-term trend. What you would expect if carbon dioxide were driving warming is that this should be warming dramatically. It's not, but there's lots of variability, no long-term trend. Well, maybe it's not the mean temperature. Maybe it's the extreme in temperature, because we're told climate change is increasing the frequency and temperature of extreme heat waves. And in particular, the Washington Post said summer in America is becoming hotter, longer, and more dangerous. Except, of course, it's not. This is a graph courtesy John Christie at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. We're looking at these same UHCN stations. These are stations that go back for 105 years. And we're looking at temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And what you can see is here's the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. You can see the droughts of the 1950s. You can see a particularly dry year, which had very high temperatures in 1980. You can see conditions around 2011, 2012, if you remember that. Again, lots of variability, but no long-term trend to extreme temperatures.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Are these slides available to?
I can make them available to you, sure. So, and also on them, you'll notice I give you the URL where you can get your own data, so you can play with them if you'd like. So we go back to our USHCN stations. Maximum air temperature in Fahrenheit for the contiguous United States, we can plot that. Again, there's lots of variability, but no long-term trend either. Well, maybe it's wildfires, the results of increased temperature. Maybe that's causing it, and of course governments are unprepared, says the United Nations. So here's what we see from acreage burn from about the late 50s to current conditions. There is a slight increase associated with it. And if we look out here, I've added 2023. 2023 was a low year in the United States. Actually, it wasn't that bad relative to 25 years ago. But if you add the remainder part of this record in, you see that the 1930s had an awful lot of burned acreage, and it was much very commonplace. Well, why is that? Well, one of the things that happened in the 40s and 50s, again, is we have airplanes. We start to have, out in here in the 70s, more satellite records, so we have a better chance of seeing the spatial extent of these fires. We can measure, we can know where it's developing and moving, we can move people around to the correct location, we can move resources, and so forth. We just didn't have that in the 20s and 30s. And so as a result, we see there's a lot of acreage burned back then, it decreased off, and now we've seen a little bit of an increase here lately, but some of that's due to the fact that we haven't allowed brush to be cleared, we haven't allowed old growth trees to be harvested. We've changed sort of the way in which business used to be done.
So David, if you go back even further in history, there's obvious more history of fire.
I just don't have the data from the National Forest Service.
Do you know, would that have, is it lower fires in, before the 20s, or is it about the same, or what?
That I can't tell you offhand. Yeah. But maybe it's super hurricanes. I mean, this is the second day of this hurricane season. We're told hurricane season this year is supposed to be intense. We were told that last year and it didn't manipulate, but we're supposed to be this year. And of course, climate change is rapidly fueling these super hurricanes. Hurricane Irma's epic size is being fueled by global warming. So let's look at the data. And this data, again, comes from NOAA and from a colleague of mine at NOAA, who was Ryan Malley, who was NOAA's chief scientist at the time. You can see at the top we have we can see at the top, that's too fast. We can see at the top we have tropical storms, lots of variability, no long-term trend. Hurricanes, again, lots of variability, no long-term trend. And interestingly, just a year and a half ago, we were at a low that had only been seen 3 times since 1970, hurricane activity. So is carbon dioxide, is climate change creating changes in tropical storms and hurricanes? It doesn't appear so. Well, maybe it's not hurricanes in total, maybe it's extreme hurricanes. So we can look at that as well. Here are all hurricanes at the top, the previous curve we had, and now these are major hurricanes, hurricanes whose maximum wind speed reaches or exceeds 100 knots. And again, you can see lots of variability, but no long-term trend. And again, 2 years ago, you can see we were at an all-time low since 1980 in hurricane activity, major hurricane activity. Well, maybe it's not the number of hurricanes, it's the energy associated with all the hurricanes. And we measure that using called the Accumulated Cyclone Energy Index. And so here you can see the ACE for both global, northern hemisphere. You can see the 1990s were particularly active in terms of the energy associated with all the storms. You can see in the mid-aughts, whatever that's called, you can see here again in the mid-teens, we had increases. We can see lots of cyclical characteristics and variability. Again, no long-term trend. Well, maybe it's hurricane landfalls. They're making more frequent. In fact, this is the first graph. We actually have a curve that has a trend to it, and the trend surprisingly is down. If we look at the North Atlantic and Western Pacific basins, these are the two basins with the most hurricanes in them, we see that the total hurricane landfalls has actually been decreasing since 1940. Why that happens, I have no idea. There's no rational reason for it, but that's the way the data read, that the 1940s and 50s were simply more active in terms of landfalls than they are now. It sort of leads people into a false sense of security that they won't hit us. They can, they might. Pay attention, particularly we always say that at the beginning of the season, which was yesterday. So I've done my duty there. Well, maybe it's not hurricanes, maybe it's tornadoes. And we recently had a number of dramatic tornadoes hit. In this case, climate crisis is changing the way tornadoes behave. And now you can see the annual count of US tornadoes from 1950 to 1923 has dramatically increased. But the question is, why has it dramatically increased? In 1990, we brought about something called the WSR 88D weather radar. WSR stands for Weather Surveillance Radar. 88 was 1988, version D for Doppler. Doppler is an important component. It allows you to see winds. So a lot of tornadoes that occurred, disappeared, nobody saw them, nobody reported them. Now the radar can catch them. So we get a better observational network with the radar than we had before. So if we break this into two parts, the pre-weather radar and the post-weather radar, you can now see that after the weather radars come in, there is no long-term trend. And there might have been a little bit of an increasing trend, but certainly in the latter half here, there wasn't a trend either. But let's look at the very severe tornadoes, the EF3, 2, 3, 4s, and 5s. The ones that you would have seen regardless of whether we had weather radars or not. And in fact, that is showing a decrease, that the 1940s and 50s and 60s were more active in terms of major tornadoes than they are now. And that can be explained by the fact that the Earth, that the planet has become warmer. What generally drives storminess is something called the equator to pole temperature gradient. The equator is warm, the pole is cold. The stark contrast between the two creates a crash between warm Gulf air and cold air from Canada. When you have that being a very strong difference, you get a lot of interaction, you get a lot of major storminess. If the polar regions warm, in a warmer world they will warm more than the tropics, for a number of reasons I won't go into, you would generally expect to see that the storminess would decrease. That should show up particularly in the strong storms, and it does. Low water levels on the Mississippi show climate change is altering large rivers, but we also have weather whiplash. When it goes down, it comes back up. Now, I used to be state climatologist of the state of Delaware for a bit, and one of the things I was always asked is, in northern Delaware, this is northern Delaware, Tallyville, Delaware, it is, are we seeing more floods and more droughts in northern Delaware? And the answer was always yes. Is it human induced? Yes. Does it have anything to do with climate change? No. It has everything to do with land use change. This is Tallyville, Delaware. And if you look closely, this will become US 202. It's a dirt road now. You can see that Tallyville was largely a rural community with farming. That's going to disappear, and I'll put this in motion, and you should see Tallyville. There we go. Tallyville morph from what it used to be to what it is now. Now think about it. What happened when rain fell in Tallyville in 1937? It soaked into the ground. It took a while to get to the Brandywine. What happens now? Wilmington is characterized by urban street flooding. All the impervious surfaces keep the water from soaking in. The water runs very efficiently off to the Brandywine River, and so the flood peak is exacerbated. Now also think about what happens when we're in the middle of a drought. So in this case, on the left, you have very little water needed usage. On the right, we have much more people. We have much more water-intensive activities. We have water-intensive businesses. When that resource runs low, there's not enough on the right to keep it going, and so as a result, we exacerbate the drought conditions. Now, I said this is not due to human activity. I said it's due to human activity. It's not due to climate change. The question is, how can I say that? Because NOAA keeps track of something called the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and it's essentially a simple water balance. Precipitation comes into the soil, evapotranspiration from plants in the soil surface goes out, you keep that water balance. If it were more precipitation or less precipitation, if it were more evapotranspiration or less evapotranspiration, we should see this index showing a trend over time. What you can see is the droughts of the 1950s, you can see droughts of the 1980s, you can see lots of variability, again, no long-term trend. And we can look at the other side of the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which shows wet conditions. And again, lots of variability, no long-term trend. Another thing you always hear is extreme rain and flooding will rise due to climate change. We're supposed to get more, when it rains, we get heavier rainfall events. And we show these data from NOAA that show effectively a rise, particularly since about 1960, 1970, and that rise is significant and important. Now, what do you see on that curve? Do you see a rising curve? See, I don't, because I know something about the data. What happened in 1990 is we went through the modernization of the National Weather Service. Before 1990, or through 1992, what happened was every hour somebody went out with a dipstick and measured the rainfall, recorded the rainfall, dumped it out, and waited for the next hour when they would do that over again every hour, every day, all through the year, done manually. National Weather Service says we've got a lot better technology than this, so why don't we move it? This is the manual National Weather Service 8-inch rain gauge. It's located at a height so people can get to it, so it's located here. One of the problems associated with measuring precipitation is these things don't measure precipitation well at high wind speeds. So the higher above ground you are, the more wind you have. The new gauges are called the Automated Surface Observing System, or ASOS rain gauge. It's much closer to the ground, it's about below your knee. It's equipped with a wind shield, which is what that green thing is on there. And it contains an automatic value in there that automatically records. So it doesn't wait until the end of an hour to figure out how much rain fell. When rain falls, it measures it as it falls. So there's no trend. So if we go back to that curve and we block out the National Weather Service pre-modernization and post-modernization, you can see that pre-modernization from 1910 to 1990, that curve is flat as a pancake. No trend whatsoever. And then if we go to 1995 and beyond, you can see the post-modernization actually shows a slight decrease. This jump discontinuity, as I said, is the change in gauge measurement. But what we're really seeing, and I'm not going to make a big deal about the trend because I don't think there is a significant one, is the trend literally is flat. We're seeing lots of variability again, no long-term trend. The only thing additionally we see in here is that we've changed the way in which we measure precipitation. And I can show you lots of other variables. I won't, but here's one: global weather-related disaster losses as a percent of global GDP. Essentially, we have more people building more stuff, so there's more stuff in danger, but GDP has been rising too, and when you standardize for GDP, you can see globally things are getting actually better and not worse. Now the question is, why is climate so well behaved? We often are told we're at a tipping point, give us just 4 more years and we're going to wind up at a fireball Earth, and when 4 years happens, we need 8 years, it'll be, they keep setting more dates. And as I said, at some point Chicken Little becomes Chicken Liar because, well, you can't keep saying this over and over again. Why is that? It's one molecule, water vapor. Water changes phase, moves energy around. The total precipitation on the planet over the next 8 days is equal to the total amount of water in the atmosphere right now. It cycles very fast. It moves around. When it condenses, it produces clouds. Clouds are white. Clouds reflect the energy. So they change the characteristic of the surface. They change things. If it weren't for water vapor, we wouldn't have a climate that would make things habitable. Of course, if it weren't for water, we wouldn't have plants, animals, humans too, but nevertheless, water, therefore, is a key to climate. Now, I'm going to give you, well, now let me ask you a question. Where does all of this extremism come from? And it comes from climate models. Climate models are where we take all of what we think we understand about the climate system, we parameterize it in a bunch of equations, we put it into a computer model, and the computer comes out and tells us the answer. And every time we've done this, climate models almost always run hot. What I mean by running hot is that when you fire them up at the same temperature, they tend to make things warmer than they actually are. They tend to run away. There's lots of these I can show you. I'll show you one more. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 102 climate model simulations. For the upper troposphere, this is the top of the layer in which we have atmosphere, we have weather, the top of clouds, if you think of it that way. The model average is about 3/4 degree Fahrenheit per decade. The actual amount of value for that is about 1/3 of that. The models are always too hot. Question?
I can't let this go by. Last night, Mindy and I were looking at a new document that we've never seen, provided by the USDA, about how agriculture, farms, and ranches are supposed to be, and this, we're going to start seeing this very soon, part of a kind of cap and trade scheme, trading credits, carbon credits. And they mention the IPCC as an organization that we should be paying attention to because they are the experts.
Most people don't quite understand what the IPCC is. You think it's a group of scientists that produce the best science. And then the summary for policymakers is the cliff notes of what they've produced. That can't be further from the truth. What actually happens is you have a bunch of policymakers that create the summary for policymakers. They then run back to the science and say, can you change the science so we can make this statement? That's actually the way it works. And then when they've come up with their summary for policymakers, it's a one nation, one vote. It's not based in science, it's based on nations, and if a nation objects to that sentence, the way it's written, or its conclusion altogether, it gets removed. They can veto it. So it's not done by science, it's not the cliff notes. If you read the summary for policymakers, it is inherently more scary than the actual science document. It will say things like, carbon dioxide is an existential threat to the planet, and then when you read the science document, there's none of that in there. In fairness, the science document is a lot fairer, but they know very well nobody's going to spend their time reading the science document because it's for us eggheads. It's all the data, all the information that you ever want to know. It's overload. Most people don't go there. They go to the cliff notes, they go to the summary, and that's where you get a different solution than you saw when you were looking at the science document.
Right. Okay.
I can tell you the National Climate Assessment is worse because the science is written by policymaker people who want that to be extreme. And that was one of the things we tried to fight. Weren't able to do so. Yes?
Can you tell me why the scientific community is not up at arms at all this lack or lies?
All money. I was at the University of Oklahoma as a faculty member in 1990. Okay, and it was the 100th anniversary, well, the 101st anniversary of the land run, 100th anniversary of the creation of the University of Oklahoma. Okay, and so they brought a lot of people in from a number of different areas to talk about their science and where they thought their science was going to go in the next 20, 30, 40 years beyond. We brought in, the School of Meteorology brought in Bob Carell, who was a federal government guy. And he lamented the fact that all the money that was going to science, particularly in the environmental aspect, was going to two places. One, to the solid earth geophysicists, so they could drill big holes in the ground. And two, to interplanetary astrophysicists, so they could put up satellites, so they could put up big space telescopes in the ground. They got all the money. We were atmospheric science. We got virtually nothing. We were the poor stepchildren. But he said that's about to change. We're on the verge of climate change research, and we're going to get money beyond our wildest dreams. And I'm expecting him next to say, and this is what we're going to do with it, we're going to be able to increase our ability to forecast hurricanes, tornadoes, forecast the next 5, 10 days. We're going to be able to do all of these things. He mentioned none of that. He simply said, we better not kill the goose that's laying the golden egg. That's the issue. We are now getting lots of money. Keep telling these people what they want to hear. They'll keep the funding going. In particular, that is what's driving academia. I mean, you look at anything within academia. You look at the people that bring in lots of money are the ones the university loves. If you're saying anything counter to bringing in lots of money, Peter Redd, me, others that criticize it, the university turns on you because they don't want to hear that. So if you're a new faculty member coming along, you're trying to get tenure, what are you going to do? You're going to say what you think, get in trouble? That was what tenure was supposed to be all about originally. But now, what you want to do is play the game. Go along, people will love you, the university will give you tenure, and you better not drop off because they'll turn on you like a viper.
I've also read that scientists who object are pretty much turned out of their community, like
yeah,
from their jobs, ostracized.
Been there, done this.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I left the University of Delaware. It was fine until about 2008, and then it went hard off the rails. Most universities are where socialist views are developed and taught, and that's only become more true in the past 10, 15 years. Yes?
So what is the funding mechanism, like who is funding this type of research and things like that? What?
U.S. government. And this is one of the things was warned about by Eisenhower on his final statement when he went out of office. He talked about the military-industrial complex, which a lot of people quote, but he also talked about the idea that the government could start funding areas and spending lots of money in it, and they would get what they were funding. That if you fund something to find X, X magically happened. Because we're going to get money to do that, we found it. It's no longer the quest for, we'll give you some money, you tell us what the answer is. It's, we think this is the answer, here's some money, what did you find? Well, you're going to find that answer so you can get more money. That was his argument, and that's exactly what's happened.
So then what's the reason behind that?
The reason behind getting money?
No, the reason behind wanting a particular outcome.
Because it fits the socialist agenda. One of the things I'm going to talk about later is in particular how we get there and why we've gotten there. There's also a chapter I have in the book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism, which was written by Cal Beisner and I and a number of other people. It's an edited volume. I didn't sell it here, but if you look it up on Amazon or whatever, you can find it. There's a chapter 2, I think, I wrote on the history of the climate change movement, how it got started, how it developed, and why, if you're going to enact global socialism, you enact local socialism, you can do it through making the haves and have-nots fight each other. How do you do that with governments? And one of the things they found is you've got to have a way of demonstrating to the developed world that you got developed for non-good reasons. And so therefore, you stole all that from the rest of the world. You need to give back to the general population. And that's where climate change came in. That we are destroying the environment because of your development. You need to pay the UN, and we will redistribute the wealth. So it's the socialist model for the globe as opposed to the socialist model for a country where you can target individual people. Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism by Regnery Press. It's by Cal Beisner, B-E-I-S-N-E-R, and myself. So, as I was saying, we had models that run hot. The question is, why do they do that? And we can talk about all the physics and so forth and what we think, but actually it's really, really simple. That the change in temperature over time, which is that curve we were seeing, is really due to two things. One, the model is too sensitive to carbon dioxide. And two, the model is being driven by carbon dioxide, which is growing too fast. So you take the one on the left and you make it too big, the one on the right and you make it too big, and the change in temperature over time becomes too big. Let me explain. So the first one is what we call climate sensitivity. Change carbon dioxide, what kind of change do you get in temperature? Everybody thought that that was coming, well, some of us didn't, but everybody on the outside thought that this was the case. You put all the physics together, all the uncertainties, and the model tells you what that number should be. What they finally admitted to in 2017 is that number is actually a tunable parameter. You can set that model to 0, which means your model has no response whatsoever to carbon dioxide. You can set it to something ridiculously high, which says a small change in carbon dioxide sets the planet ablaze. What do you set that number to? The argument has been they've set that number too high. Over time, you can see our estimates of this climate sensitivity have been going down, so that most of the observational-based estimates are down in here. But the IPCC, the models have stayed high, and now they're unreasonably high. So the the model is too sensitive to carbon dioxide. It gives you too big of a temperature change. The second part of that is the increase over time. How fast is carbon dioxide going to rise between now and 2100? We don't know. We haven't gotten to 2100 yet. But they always drive it with a weird scenario. This is actually an article by some believers. This is one of the things we were trying to fight in the National Climate Assessment, is that there are a number of highly unlikely scenarios. There are a number of likely scenarios. Want to guess which one is most often used for scientific research? Yeah, the one that's listed highly unlikely. Why? Because they like to hit the model with a big hammer. You get a big signal. You can make big signals statistically significant. But that's unrealistic. Essentially, to get that kind of amount of energy going into the system, you have to convert everything over to dirty coal. And I mean everything. All your nuclear, all your natural gas, all your wind, all your solar, everything would have to go that to try to get that curve. And nobody believes that's reasonable. But over half of the articles published use that curve. What we should be using is modest mitigation way down here. And the one I showed before actually used that. So these models are running hot, not because they're using a curve that's based upon, running hot simply because they're using a scenario of climate sensitivity that has too much sensitivity. But when you use these extreme temperature changes, you get models that do this. And you can see out by 2100, here's the warming on the order of 9, 10, 11, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. That's unrealistic. Here's the observations. These have taken off. This is why you get, things are going to happen in the future that are dramatically ridiculous. They're not. And that's why the models always give you bad answers. They're run with bad inputs. Now, I didn't tell you this, but this is what we keep forcing on the general public. Carbon dioxide is not an evil gas. In fact, it's plant food. Dr. Sylvan Whitwer, an agronomist at the Agricultural Experiment Station in Michigan State, said it should be considered good fortune that we are living in a world of gradually increasing levels of carbon dioxide. The rising level of atmospheric CO2 is a universally free premium, gaining in magnitude with time, on which we can all reckon for the foreseeable future. Ms. Jane Benyus, who was the Rachel Carson Environmental Ethics Award winner, if you think about that for a moment, she said, organisms don't think of CO2 as a poison. Plants and organisms that make shells, coral, think of it as a building block. And indeed, if you ever went into a greenhouse, and I'm sure everybody in the room's probably been in a greenhouse, you know there's a little box in the corner somewhere that produces carbon dioxide. Commercial greenhouses generally crank up the carbon dioxide 2, 3, 4 times ambient. Why is that? Because that creates building blocks that the plants grow. This is Sherwood Itso from Phoenix. He was with the Arizona State University. He did this study a number of years ago. He took seedlings and he grew them, gave them all the water they needed, but grew them in different carbon dioxide environments. Then after a while, stopped and took pictures of them. Here's one in ambient CO2 of 350 parts per million. By the time he stopped, it was up to about his belt. He did some in 150 enhanced CO2, 150 parts per million. They grew to be about as high as his breastbone. At 300 parts per million, they were now as high as his collarbone, and by 450 parts per million, they were as high as he was. More carbon dioxide makes plants grow faster. His son has continued this. I think these are P varieties. You can see 461, 782, and 1218 parts per million, and you can see how that has grown over time. So more carbon dioxide, you get more growth. Again, building block. The second national assessment made the statement that corn will fail to reproduce at temperatures above 95 Fahrenheit. So if we get above 95 Fahrenheit, you can give up on growing any corn anywhere. In fact, if you went to Iowa State University, agronomy department, they said that if nutrition and water availability being there, so the ideal temperature for crop growth is somewhere around 93. Common corn varieties will grow fastest at 93. They only stop growing when you get up to 115. And if you'll notice, that curve is fairly flat at the top. Small changes in temperature aren't going to affect corn output quite a bit. But there's some interesting other features that come about. These are higher concentrations of CO2, have 2 additional added benefits. In blue, we have 360 parts per million. In red and orange, we have 720 parts per million. And if we have open arrows, or open boxes, I should say, they are water stressed, and closed boxes are well watered. But what you can see is, in both cases, you get 360 parts per million requires more water than higher carbon dioxide. So increasing carbon dioxide means plants will use less water. This is an article that came out recently. Rising carbon dioxide is making the world's plants more water wise. And of course, they said global change is causing the world's plants to grow in a more water efficient way. Why is that? Well, if you think about the stomates on the other side of plants, if you've got more carbon dioxide, it's easier for carbon dioxide to diffuse into the stomates. You don't have to open as much, so you're not going to lose as much water vapor. The second thing we can say is that higher CO2 concentrations dramatically raise the optimum growth temperature. So as you increase carbon dioxide concentrations, the optimum growth temperature actually creeps upward with temperature as well. So the net effect is that elevated CO2 means the plant uses less water and produces more food. That leads, as it says, to a greener planet. Well, is the planet greening? One of the things we can do is look at this with satellites. And except in areas where we're in obvious deserts to begin with, except where desertification is taking place, where deforestation is occurring, or where urbanizing growth is taking place, most of the rest of the planet is greening, and greening considerably. You can see we have a lot of dark greens out there. Dark green is 25 to 33% increase, not trivial. How do we know that?
David, they would also, the narrative would also be, or that I've heard, is that because of global warming, we're getting the greening.
Right. So how can I say this is not related to temperature, but in fact related to carbon dioxide?
Right.
That's my next slide.
Okay.
Thank you. So this is an article just came out this past month. And it says, they looked into whether it's carbon dioxide, solar radiation changes, changes in water availability, changes in soil moisture in general, changes in air temperature. And they concluded 75% of the planet is driven by this increase in carbon dioxide as to why the greening is happening. There are places, for example, you can see up in the extreme Siberian region, for example, where it's driven by air temperature. A couple of places in here in the Brazilian rainforest, also where it's temperature or solar radiation, but nevertheless, most of the planet, 3/4 of it, is a carbon dioxide signal.
So if you're worried about a food crisis, you would want more greening, you would want, right?
Plants will grow better.
But their goal is to decarbonize, decrease the carbon.
Right,
So that would then create a food crisis.
that's my argument. Here are long-lived trees. These are trees that live 1,000, 2,000 years. They're bristlecone pine, liver pine, foxtail pine in the U.S. Great Basin, bristlecone pine in Colorado. They're all showing an increase with increased carbon dioxide, particularly in the latter portion of the record. Former President Jimmy Carter said the path to global peace is to raise the standard of living of millions of rural people who live in poverty by increasing agricultural productivity. Thriving agriculture is the engine that fuels broader economic growth and development, thus paving the way for prosperity and peace. Sylvan Whitner, the rising level of atmospheric CO2 could be the one global natural resource that is progressively increasing food production and total biological output. The effects know no boundaries, and both developing and developed countries are and will be sharing equally. So based upon all this, I'm going to leave you with the following conclusion. Climate change will adversely affect agriculture. Now, if you've been following along, almost everything I said was counter to that. So I need to change this slightly. It's climate change policy that will adversely affect agriculture. It's not the change of climate, it's the change that we're attempting to do in the policy to try to protect the planet that's actually going to hurt agriculture. And part of that's related, much of that's related, to this net zero concept, net zero emissions operations by 2050, including a 65% reduction by 2030. I can tell you last year in Delaware, we signed into law HB House Bill 99. House Bill 99 guarantees this will happen in the state of Delaware. We have got all sorts of concomitant legislation, which I'll talk about in a moment coming up, in order to try to force this to happen. And much of it affects agriculture. Because stop and think about it for a moment. If you've got to get a 65% reduction within the next 7 years, you've got to go after the two biggest producers of trace gases, and that's transportation and agriculture. And agriculture gets hit twice because how do you move the goods from food to table, or from field to table? It is a transportation network. So both of those are going to be directly impacted. Here's the total greenhouse gas emissions from food production. And you can see food accounts for about 1/4 of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So first, agriculture is going to be attacked. You can see some of this is related to land use, some of it's related to crop production, livestock and fisheries, and then as I said, the interaction between transportation and agriculture, which is a supply chain. How do you move stuff from production to getting it to the individual people? And that's where all this kicks in. We've talked a lot about carbon dioxide as a gas. One of the things that Delaware farmers have been told, because we've signed on to HB 99, is we don't expect you to convert your combines over yet to electric vehicles. But we do expect that in the next couple of years, there will be legislation that will require all of the trucks that you use. Now here's the problem. I live in southern Delaware, which is a very agricultural area. Last year we had a bumper crop of corn, and these trucks were going by my house 24/7, carting corn out. In fact, we had so much corn, the grain elevators became full. They started literally putting them on the ground, covering them with tarps. Just so much of it. We've had the issue that there is a law now that school buses must become EV. What they're finding is they have to buy twice as many school buses. You use a school bus in the morning, take the children from home to school, you go back and you start the recharging process, but you can't get it recharged by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So you have to have a second school bus available in order to take the kids home, so that the first one can recharge overnight and be ready for the next day. It's twice the expense, twice the number of school buses. These run 24/7. How many of those are you going to have when you recharge them? That's the problem. And it's going to be thrown onto the grid, which can't sustain a lot more increasing carbon dioxide, or increasing, I should say, electric demand.
So the other thing that I sit on one of the boards that handles transportation for my area. And the other thing, the issue we're having with the school buses that are electric is that we have changes in elevation. So we have a couple of our towns that, you have to go up into the foothills.
Yep.
And especially in the wintertime, they can't, even if you have a full battery, they're not gonna make it up and back.
See, Delaware's a flat state. We don't have hills to worry about.
In California we do.
But in California you do, in Minnesota you do, I understand. And the other problem too is that, I was gonna say something else, I forgot. Anyway.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. So, we talked about carbon dioxide quite a bit. What about methane? Where does that play a role? Now, if you look at the number at the bottom, that number doesn't necessarily mean much to you. The way you can get that number is think of a stadium that's equal to the size of the University of Michigan. Seats 100,000 people. Now imagine 10 of those, okay? In all 10 of those stadiums, 2 seats would have the word methane on them. That's what that concentration means. Okay, so we're talking about really, really small concentrations. Methane, we said, has a lot more potential because it dances in a variety of different ways. But of course, how does methane get into the atmosphere? Again, you know the answer. It's ruminants. So beef cattle, dairy cattle, sheep, goats are all under attack. In fact, what we want you to do is give up altogether on using meat and go to a vegetarian or a vegetable alternative. So that's why you see Beyond Burger, Beyond Beef, Beyond Sausage, Beyond everything is being touted.
The Olympics is pushing, the next Olympics is pushing plant-based.
Of course.
food.
British is taking it one step further. Why don't we just have food rationing? Limit the amount of food that people can have. And decide, I guess, who gets it and who doesn't. The other thing that's happening in Delaware is methane or natural gas connections. There is now a law that if you go to build a new apartment complex or if you go to build a new house, you may not have a connection to natural gas. You may not. And what's going to come, they've already said, is at some point down the road, they're going to make it illegal to replace in kind. So if your gas-powered stove goes up, you're going to have to buy an electric equivalent and pay to put in an electric connection for it. If your gas-powered furnace goes up, you're going to have to pay to have an electric furnace put in. So you're not going to be allowed to move to natural gas. In fact, there's going to be a forced movement away from natural gas. But the one molecule people don't understand how important it is, and in particular how important it's going to be for agriculture, is laughing gas, also known as nitrous oxide. That number is really small. You would need 100 University of Michigan stadium, and then 3 seats in one of those would be labeled nitrous oxide. How does nitrous oxide get into the atmosphere? Oh, you can see what is nitrous oxide, why is it a climate threat? And emission of nitrous oxide, a climate super pollutant, are rising fast on a worst case trajectory. So the question is, how does this stuff get into the atmosphere? You can see that nitrous oxide makes up about 7% of greenhouse gas emissions, but 3/4 of that 7% come directly from agricultural soil management. So if you want to push everybody off onto vegetable-based stuff, now we're going to fight that too. So that's where we're going to stop. If you look at, for example, this graph, you can see nitrous oxide in the atmosphere leads to the production of nitrogen. But what happens is we have a fertilizer plant taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere. It puts it into the soil when it's used as synthetic circulation, and this curve is enhanced, which means the amount of nitrous oxide goes up. How do you stop that from happening? You stop fertilizer plants from acting. We stop the production of synthetic fertilizer. And if you do that, this curve slows down, therefore the amount of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere winds up decreasing, and to them, that's a good thing.
This is a great slide. Remember at our Sacramento annual meeting, how this is exactly what he was showing us, which is they're trying to say it's bad, and he was saying, actually, it's really good for the environment. So that was that UC Davis doctor.
And I needn't tell you why you use fertilizer. I mean, you need to be farming down here as opposed to farming up here. But the idea is that nitrogen fertilizer has been a boon. Again, I'm talking to the wrong group. But the idea is when you look at corn, wheat, barley, hay, oats, rye, all of those were down around here until the use of nitrogen fertilizer kicked in. And then the yield coming off of these has been factors of 3, 4, 5. You want to feed the world? It's fertilizer. It's done the job. And why do I say that? Well, if we keep going, you'll see in a minute. But the problem is there is this attack on nitrogen. Getting ahead of myself. Getting attack on this by a number of different countries. This is Canada, Trudeau's nitrogen policy. And in the article it says, in December of 2020, the Trudeau government unveiled their new climate plan with a focus on reducing nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. It says nitrous oxide emissions, particularly those associated with synthetic nitrogen fertilizer use, have also grown significantly. That's why the government of Canada has set the national fertilizer emissions reduction target, which is part of the commitment to reduce total global greenhouse gas emissions in Canada by 40 to 50% by 2030. Again, that's within about 6.5 years from now. How are they going to do that? They're going to stop them from using synthetic fertilizer. When farmers knew this, they protested. Same thing happened in the Netherlands. Dutch government set targets to cut nitrogen pollution. Farmers went up in arms and protested. Sri Lanka went one step further. They had a complete fertilizer ban. They wound up in a self-imposed famine. They couldn't feed their people because they weren't able to produce as much grain, and they just couldn't feed the people.
So did the farmers' objectives do anything to change the policy?
No.
In Sri Lanka it did.
In Sri Lanka it did because they were starving. Yeah. Because it was not the farmers complaining, it was the people complaining. Yeah, people didn't have food to eat. Yeah, that'll drive you to action, right? Corn yields.
And Sri Lanka went one step further. They said only organic material.
Yeah.
So that even hurt them even more and put them faster into a famine. And their GDP just destroyed.
Yeah.
So they did the organic and the banned fertilizer.
Yeah. Corn yields in the United States went up in the 1940s. That's when we started to increase fertilizer. There's also other advantages to modern farming. Wheat yield in world and the United States have gone up. Again, I'm talking to the wrong group. I like this curve in particular. Arable land need to produce a fixed quantity of crops. Today we're getting about 3 times as much food out of the same acreage as we were getting in 1961. That's 1961, not 1861. So in just my lifetime, I was born in 61, so in my lifetime, we're getting 3 times as much food out as we were before. And I like this curve in particular. You can see the world population growth. You can see there's a world population supported by synthetic fertilizer. This is all famine, except the world population fed by synthetic fertilizer makes up that difference. You want to feed the world? It's through fertilizer. It's through modern farming. You start cutting all this out, what's going to happen? We're going to wind up killing people. And I'm afraid that's the plan. This is known as the Ehrlich-Holdren equation. Some of you may know Paul Ehrlich. In the 1970s, the idea was that there would be a massive die-off, 65 million Americans dead by 1989. I remember when that happened. No, I don't, because it never did happen. But his argument has always been to reduce population. His student was John Holdren, who became Obama's Office of Science and Technology policy person. They came up with the following equation. I equals P times A times T. It's a simple math equation.
I'm stressing it out.
Sorry. I is environmental impact, and it's always negative, meaning it's bad. What we want to do is minimize I. How do you minimize I? You make P as small as possible, you make A as small as possible, and you make T as small as possible. What is P? P is population. You want few people. You kill them off early in life, you kill them off in the middle of life, you kill them off in the later of life. You make sure you've got few people on the planet. The second is A, and that's affluency. Those that do make it, we have to keep dirt poor. And the final one is technology. You have to keep them dirt poor, and you have to keep them technologically disadvantaged. What that means is they're going to have 16 kids because 14 of them are going to die before they get to puberty. They're going to die of dysentery, but they're also going to die of starvation. But if you don't care about people, that's not a problem. That's just collateral damage. If you do care about people, you would never be playing this equation. World population living in extreme poverty. So in 1820, you can see we had 1 billion people, and there's about, I think it's a little overstated, but there's about 90% of the population living in extreme poverty. And by the time we get out to 1960, we've gotten up to 3.5 billion. We're doing a little bit better, not a little bit more than 10% above extreme poverty, but the number of people in poverty is growing. Now, we knew this curve was going to continue up, and by now, it's up to almost 8 billion people. But what happened to the poverty line? In fact, that not only went down in terms of percentages, it went down in terms of total number. So that now we have the number of people living in extreme poverty is only about 10% of the global population. That's 10% too much, but it's a whole lot better than it was back in 1820s. How did we get there? Modern farming, being able to feed people. There's 4 things that you need: food, clothing, shelter, security. If you don't have any of the 4, you will move heaven and earth to get them. If you have the 4, you can then start to take care of your environment. Why in India, for example, do they go into, they use the Ganges River as both their water supply and as their toilet? Because they're fighting for food, clothing, shelter, and security. Okay? The environment is not an issue. Take care of those 4, and then they can start to worry about other things, particularly things like cleaning up your environment. The last thing I want to leave you with, and this is happening in Delaware, but I know it's also happening in Iowa, it's happening in Oregon, it's happening all over the place. This is Stop Solar Pollution in Delaware. The idea is that Delaware, through its legislature and through federal grants, is trying to get people to stop farming. And I've got a Republican congressman who says, well, this isn't an issue. I know farmers have every right to do whatever they want with their land. And in particular, Delaware farmland is only 0.5% of all the farmland in the country. I say, but it's happening everywhere. And what's happening when you take money out of my pocket to pay off groups, to make money, which then makes food go up, it's going to be a problem. I mean, I live in Sussex County. Sussex County has more chickens than any county in the country. Okay, chickens need food also, and they live largely off the food we produce. But there's this push to get farmland into solar farms, or I should call them solar factories. And that's been one of the big push, is to get rid of farming. Because farming is bad, it produces carbon dioxide, it produces nitrogen oxide, nitric oxides, it produces methane. It would be better if we just didn't have farming at all. And I'm not sure what they think the Southern Delaware economy is going to do, but I don't know what they think we're going to eat. So at this point, let me leave you with a final thought, that this is simply an assault on agriculture. And I've been fighting with a number of groups to try to stop this, and I hope you'll join us. Thank you very much.
rapid fire before we take a 10-minute
Or slow
break?
fire, it doesn't have to be fast.
You were appointed to what role? How long did it last?
Where?
Under the
Oh,
last
I-
administration?
I-
What would you have done?
on September 8th, I was appointed to the NOAA as the, what was it? I've got it on there somewhere. It's on as the Deputy Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction.
And what would that have done?
Nothing. The reason I was put there, the reason I was put there was an attempt to get me to help work on the National Climate Assessment. And after about a month and a half, the Chief of Staff said, "What's he doing here?" And the White House said, "He's here to run the National Assessment because the National Assessment goes through NOAA." And he said, "No, the National Assessment goes through the U.S. Global Change Research Program. U.S. Global Change Research Program is run out of the White House through OSDP. If this is what you wanted, you should have put him in the White House and not here." So the next thing you know, I went to the White House. And I was executive director of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I was there for 9 weeks. Of those 9 weeks, we had Christmas, we had New Year's, we had Thanksgiving, we had the last week where it was transitioned back, and we had the American Meteorological Association meeting, so they closed down for that. So of the 9 weeks I was there, I was only there 4 weeks. I still got charged by someone there with crimes that would have put me in jail for up to 5 years and fined $5 million. And I can show you, I do not have a chain or a thing around my leg that keeps track of where I am. That was all made up. But nevertheless, one of the things I did discover is that a lot of people think the U.S. Global Change Research Program is part of the federal government. It is, but it's not staffed by federal people. It's staffed by a group called ICF International Incorporated, and you should look them up. ICF originally stood for the Inner City Fund, which was originally designed in the 1960s by several Tuskegee Airmen and defense contractors so that black researchers could get into defense contracting. Shortly thereafter, it changed and it morphed its character and became an environmental organization. And now that's why they changed from the Inner City Fund to just the acronym ICF. Okay, they are, if they read the discussion, it says it's managed by 13 agencies. Those 13 agencies, though, don't contribute people. People are contributed by ICF, who hires them outside, and they come in to work for the government. Why this is so important is they produce the National Climate Assessment. They also produce the annual report to Congress on climate change. They also run globalchange.gov. So when you go to globalchange.gov, when you look at the National Assessment, when you look at the annual report by the federal government to Congress on what is happening in terms of climate change, remember, these are all being written by an independent environmental organization that is not part of the federal government, but they are paid by the federal government. They were making $3.2 billion a year under the Trump administration, and they are now this year making, I think it's $5.2 billion. So they're making a whole lot more money now than they were just 2 years ago. They have to be stopped.
Who are some credible sources, like we see all these government agencies and they're all telling us lies. Where can we go to find, besides you, thank you for this, by the way, where can we go to find actual people who support things that you have just brought out as what is the truth about climate change?
One of the things I did, I've worked with the Heartland group. They produced a series of documents called NIPCC, which stands for the Non-Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is a scientific document full of citations on all sorts of topics. There's one on biological aspects, there's one on fossil fuels. These are huge volumes, and they include science. So that's where I would go to find the real science. We probably need to update them at some point because they're getting out of date. I don't know if there's plans.
Yeah, I have one, I was gonna read it because I knew we were talking about this here, but it is probably 15 years old.
Yeah.
And so
Well,
other groups?
there's one that I was involved with, is probably the last one they produced, which I think is fossil fuels and energy. That one's, I think, only about 5 or 6, maybe 7 years old. But yeah, you're right. That's been the issue, is they're starting to get out of date. They need to be updated. There have been a number of books come out. I made a shameless plug for my own, but there have been a number of books that have come out by other people recently that have a lot of information. And again, you just have to know who's writing the book and what bias they're coming from.
Then one more thing is like these black farms. People are accusing agriculture of all of these side effects and climate change issues that are not really true. Why aren't they looking at the side effects of the solar panels? Like the not being able to, like the short life cycle of them, like they're not biodegradable. There are so many, and the fake meat, all of the energy that it takes to grow those. Where is that information for us?
I have written 2 articles on those for A Better Delaware, which I'm familiar with. With respect to fake meat, there are 2 types of fake meat. There's one to make it look like meat, and there's one to make it a meat substitute. The one that makes it look like meat is failing dramatically and will probably drop from the market, because if you're a vegan, you don't want to eat something that looks like meat. That making it look like meat by creating a blood component from beets is not what those kind of people are interested in. But if you get to, what was the other one you mentioned?
Solar?
Solar, yeah. Everybody thinks wind and solar are clean and green. They require an awful lot of rare earth minerals. And where do you get those? See, many of these don't exist, they're not really rare, but they don't exist in seams like we find with coal or copper. They exist all over the place. And so what you do is you take and you literally remove the side of the mountain, you put it in a toxic sludge, and then you use that toxic sludge to get the stuff to congeal out. Now you need somebody to go in there and do it. So if you're in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you get kids to go in and do it. If you're in Southeast Asia, you get the Uyghurs to go in as slaves to do it. Well, this involves social justice issues. This involves that it's producing a lot of toxic waste that just simply never goes away. Most people never see that. They see essentially, a solar panel sitting there. It collects solar radiation. It produces energy. It's clean. It's green. It's free. But to get there, all of the information, all of the data and so forth, all of the ingredients require an awful lot, which makes them effectively not clean and not green. But we keep saying clean, green, renewable energy. I mean, Delaware has gone to the extreme. For example, we have paid money to Bloom Energy to have a fuel cell that takes natural gas and converts it to energy, and we've called that renewable energy. Only in Delaware can you relabel natural gas as a renewable energy source. Nobody else on the planet would be doing that. We've done it because there was a sweetheart deal to Bloom Energy, and have been fighting that one too.
And then as far as policy with the wind turbines, they're set in the migrating birds pathway.
Yep.
We manufacture feed supplements and they're served in an open trough to cattle. And we've had some people on the Forest Service see dead birds in there. So we were turned in and I was like, we need to do something about this. Talked to Jim Beers, he was a former forest ranger. And they said, well, there's nothing really you can do about it. But then later on, he said, so now the wind turbines have so much clout in DC that they are not liable for any migration birds, that they're killing eagles and all of these, as long as it wasn't intended. So if they're using them, so if I drive a car and I hit somebody and I didn't intend to hit somebody, I shouldn't be responsible, right?
Yeah. I have seen all of this happening in Delaware. Delaware is a bird migration area. They land particularly in the middle of the state, Kent County. They feed on, a lot of bird types feed on the eggs of the horseshoe crab. Horseshoe crab looks like something out of a prehistoric area. It's It's a horseshoe with a thing with a tail sticking out the back. If you flip it over, there's just a bunch of legs and that's it. There's no eating to them. But essentially what they do is they grow. At the end of the season, they go off to the continental shelf, and you don't see them. And then they come back on land to spawn, lay their eggs, flip upside down, and rot. And the place stinks. But birds love their eggs. So we are on the migration pattern of almost everybody. And I almost put that in here. But from South America to all the way up in northern Canada, the stopover on the flight is in Delaware. So now what are we doing? We're putting up wind farm right off the Delaware shore. They were doing the testing for the wind farm off the New Jersey shore. Whales were showing up on the beach with problems. New Jersey stopped doing the thing, not because of that reason, but because the deal fell through. Whale beaching stopped. We started within a week whale beached in southern Delaware. The problem does become, what are we going to do to these birds that migrate through all these wind turbines? We had one put in literally in southern Delaware by the University of Delaware. And the argument is they collect birds, but for the bird to be counted as a turbine death, it has to be underneath the base of the turbine. So if the bird flies along, hits the turbine, and goes way off here, it wasn't a turbine death, because it wound up over here, not underneath the turbine. It has to hit and fall straight down. That's the way they got around defining it. It's always a shell game. I mean, one turbine has created as much discussion down in Lewis, Delaware as anything else. There are people complaining that the whirring of the blades create problems. And the reason why there are problems with birds is they're moving, so the tip speeds are sometimes over 200 miles an hour. And so the birds just don't realize this thing's coming along. You've got a bunch of migrating plovers or whatever they are, bang, they're hit by this thing, down they go. I'm waiting for a number of birds to show up washed on the shore from these turbines and watch what the environmentalists do. Could be the fight between environmentalists, and I would back that. What's that? Well, this is one turbine. They're going to put a whole 178 or some such nonsense off the coast of Delaware and Maryland. And then the problem is how you get the power in, and so they're going to come in through our beaches, and then it's got to go into the PGM grid. To get there, it's got to go across Delaware. They're just going to abscond with farmland, because nobody's using it anyway. We'll just abscond with the farmland, pay you something for it, and run all our connections in there.
My last question, how do I find out how much government subsidies are with renewable energy? Like, we're paying for all of this to put us out of business.
Could that be grants as well?
I was just gonna ask if it's from grants.
Yeah. I mean, it's online somewhere. I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly where it is. But it's an exorbitant amount of money. Yes?
Well, someone here explained too. I think that you presented a lot to us today that this has more to do with obviously politics and science. So how can we start changing any of that or shifting some of this money? Because I mean, this doesn't change unless we can do that.
Yeah. And that's been the issue in Delaware, is how do we get control of the legislature? How do we control the governor's office? How do we put a stop to that? Same thing in the federal government. You've got to have good candidates that understand the problem, that won't capitulate once they get elected. And that can happen on both sides. But we have to have people that understand this problem. A lot of them don't understand the problem. They think you've got clean and green energy. They think carbon dioxide is an evil molecule. We've got to stop it. And what they're doing is saving the planet, when in fact they're killing people on the planet.
Well, and farmers get caught in the middle because how do we turn the money down? I mean, we're talking about significant dollars. I mean, dollars that keep your family,
Especially those families that are, those members of the family that are ready for retirement and they don't have anybody else to follow. You know, their children or grandchildren have made other decisions, so you're left with this land that if another farmer isn't going to pick it up from you.
I mean, my father was a sharecropper, so he knew all about this kind of stuff. But in particular, I mean, yeah, if they're going to buy you off, do you take the money and run and let the other people fend for themselves? Or do we all get together and say, this has to stop? I mean, I don't care what you do with your land. This has been my issue with the solar panel. Just don't expect me to pay for it. If somebody's willing to pay you a certain amount to just sit out there and look at it, more power to them.
Unless it's your taxpayer dollar.
Right, unless it's my taxpayer dollar paying for it.
So, can you speak a little bit to, so after the solar farms are put in, or after the wind farms are put in, and let's say they get to their natural life, whatever that is, and you pull them out, can you talk about,
Who cleans it all up?
well, who cleans it all up, and will the land be farmable afterwards?
Good question.
They contend that there's money set aside that in 25 years it will be there for removal. They also say that a lot of it can't be recycled yet, but by the 25 years we will be there. The technology will be around so we can solve that problem later, just not now. The question then becomes, the last part of your question was?
So will the land be usable, because we were talking
Yes.
about the other night, it's like, so a lot of the stuff cemented in, there's an issue. I've heard reports and have seen videos that a lot of the windmills start to leak oil over a period of time.
Yeah.
So that's going down into, and then I don't know enough about the solar panels to know if there's any type of drainage or anything that's going into the soil from them.
There are some things in there that if they got into the soil would make the soil toxic. The question was after a hail attack on a solar panel. So they had a hailstorm go through a solar area and it was all damaged. Was there some of this material into the ground? The answer was yes. But it doesn't mean they're all in 25 years going to be hit by hailstones. That question is still out. I don't know what process would cause leaching of the material in the ground. But if they are somehow torn up or destroyed, then some of that material could get into the ground.
And what about during the removal of them?
That could be during the removal.
And are the solar panels, most of them cemented in also?
Yeah, because you don't want them floating around, and you want to they keep treating them with various things to keep grass from growing underneath, because otherwise you've got to keep cutting grass, and you can't really grow crops underneath them. So, to keep from cutting grass, we want to put herbicide down. The question is, what is 25 years of herbicide, depending on what kind of herbicide you're using, what effect will that have?
Okay, so we don't have any of those answers yet.
No, and we probably won't have them until we're ready to take one out and see what happens.
And what about the solar panels on birds and other animals that are along? What's the effect?
The general solar panel doesn't affect it. Now, they've had problems, I think in Nevada, they had a weird system where you had a bunch of solar panels that were actually not solar panels, they were reflectors, and they reflected it to a central location. So you got this compressed beam that was coming in at one location and it was using it to generate energy. And any bird flying in front of this beam would be essentially incinerated. So I don't know whether they've shut that one down or not. But it seems to be one of the bad ideas of how to do solar panels or solar wind energy. Yes?
Are you aware that today and tomorrow there is a U.S. Global Leadership Coalition meeting here over at the Hyatt, and they are going to be promoting climate change and social justice and everything.
When you say promoting climate change, you mean promoting policy to stop climate change?
Yes.
Yeah. I was not aware. I know they're everywhere, particularly in this city. So you almost can't have a meeting in DC without one of those groups showing up. And as I found recently at Heritage, they show up whether they're invited or not. Our meeting was interrupted by somebody 4 or 5 people jumping up on stage and shouting obscenities.
While David was giving
Yeah.
a presentation.
So I'm glad to see nothing happened here.
Not yet, Andrew.
Not yet, yeah, there's still a chance.
People outside the door were talking about New Year's, so it's probably
Thank you.
Quick question. When the green is measured, I assume that's by satellite data.
And so you get leaf area index.
It's a leaf area.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
It's NDVI is what it is.
Okay, so it's essentially like infrared color coded.
Yeah. For the rest of you, it's an estimate of the difference between the red channel and the infrared channel. So there's a lot, leaf area index has a high reflection in infrared but less in red, and so you can use that correlation to be able to figure out how many leaves there are per unit area.
Okay. Second question is that all the data I've seen agree with everything you've been talking about with regard to the impact of adoption of fertilizer application on a large scale. Are there data available that tease out the other factors, particularly, the boron revolution, for example, so you can see the fertilizer impact versus the other factors?
I pulled that out on the basis of time. I don't know if I can actually show that because they're all, let's see if it allows me to do this. Yes, it does. So yes, one of the things I pulled is that when you look at various species, you can go down the actual list, and here's an article, for example, that talks about sweet cherry, there's one on silver birch, there's one on yellow poplar, there's one on grasslands, there's one on green algae, purple sea urchins, the desert lizard, which isn't vegetation, but I just like the picture, wheat, rice, tomato, and cowpea. And then I'm supposed to say, oops, cowpea, sorry. But the idea is there's this website, it's CO2 Science, run by Craig Itzo. And it's a plant growth database. And literally what it has in there are a whole of these by different field names, what under 300 to 600, 900 parts per million, and essentially links to the science behind it, that people have done research on those to show what effect increasing carbon dioxide has and so forth on those. So that website, it's out of, he has not been funded to continue this, and so he's now in Minnesota running a, what do I want to say, running apartment complex, that's it.
Oh my
But we're trying to get him funding to regain this and bring it back up to date. But it's essentially by you can see we're only from B down to B's on this thing. Oh, this is just B's. So you can see we're still well within B's, looking at how much variability and documenting all this. And when you go to the actual scientists, they have a tendency to say the opposite thing than you would get from the National Climate Assessment, or that you would get from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so and like I said, all of these are independent scientists that have, raised these in different types of things and looked at how it behaved.
Who don't get funded, or at least not funded like.
Not funded to do climate change research.
Yeah.
They're funded to do agronomy research, and that's the fundamental difference.
Is your presentation available?
I can make it available, it's not a problem. Okay.
Is there anyone on Capitol Hill that you think understands what it is you presented today, that is sympathetic to our side?
Congressman LaMartha.
No, I have talked to a number of them. I don't know, some of them seem to get it at times, and then at other times they don't. And so I'm always wondering how much they really understand. I know Senator Imhoff worked with us quite a bit, but he was always at the other extreme, that there is no such thing as climate change, it's always a hoax. And while climate does change, we do have variations, we know a little bit more about it. It's not a hoax, it's just not a problem. But he sort of he's going to take a fire for it anyway. But I think there's a number of them starting to get it, and I think most of them are coming from agricultural states, because I think this is where they recognize that our living is being hit directly by this stuff, and we're going to be the first one taken down.
Any questions on geoengineering? Comment, and then we'll wrap up, and if you want to add anything else. So geoengineering, we often hear is another.
We can solve the problem through engineering, right? We can solve the global cooling problem by going up into the Arctic and putting down lots of soot. And just start covering the Arctic with soot. We will change the absorption of the reflection off of ice and snow by absorbing more energy. The temperature of the Earth will rise, and because the temperature of the Earth rises, we'll get out of global cooling. Except then we realized it wasn't global cooling, it was global warming. So the problem is, if you take these plans and you can't back out on them, what happens when you realize, A, what you were doing wasn't what you were supposed to do, or B, it had a side effect that you now can't control? That's always the problem with geoengineering, is what are the side effects that you hadn't thought about? I mean, there are people that want to link onto icebergs down in Antarctica and tow them to the Middle East. I mean, think of taking a large iceberg and towing it. How much of that is going to make itself to the Middle East? How much of it's going to become a trail of fresh water behind as it melts on the way across the equator? And how's that going to change the ecosystem locally as all this fresh water is dumped into a system that is largely salt water? So, I mean,
or solar panels on offshore, or wave makers.
Wind offshore is
Yeah,
a big thing.
and wave makers to mimic the moon and waves for weather. I mean, all this is being done.
Oh, yeah. Well, the one big question everybody has is HAARP. That's the high altitude, RRP, AARP, atmospheric
Resonance, yeah.
Right, yeah. Essentially, it's this large place up in Fairbanks, Alaska. It was designed to heat the upper ionosphere so we could learn about the really high upper atmosphere components. But it has a lore that runs around that it's everything from weather modification to controlling people's thoughts.
Yeah.
And of course, as you know, since I was working at NOAA, I always got the question, can you tell me about HAARP? And my answer was always, yes, I can, but then I'd have to kill you. I think it was doing what it was designed to do, is excite the upper atmosphere so we can learn something about it, and I don't think it's any more than that. If it were, the government would never turn it over to the University of Alaska. If it had ulterior motives that have been assigned to it, they'd have never given it up. So, yeah.
So do I also hear you saying that even a change in administration is not going to fix any of these problems you just discussed today?
It may not. The new administration has to understand the problem. One of the things I found with the last time the Trump administration was here is in fairness, they may not have understood what they were supposed to do. I know there was a fight between the group in New York City and the fight between the group in DC. There were a lot of people that were not, like, I should have been replaced, my position, I should say, should have come on 3.5 years earlier. Why it took that long to replace us from the deep state people, I cannot tell you. That should have been done early on. There's a lot of things they don't know. Heritage has come up with a book called, was it Project 2025? It's for the next administration. It is a huge, thick book, which talks about every agency, the secretaries of agency. This is what they think they need to do. Of course, I've been told they do this all the time. It's never had impact on other administrations. Why should it have an administration now? Maybe we're in a different time frame. I'm hoping we are.
So if Trump gets put back in, or if and when, do you think second time around they'll understand it better?
I hope. It depends on, again, who takes charge. There's the fear that it will be outsiders who don't understand the game, and they won't do what needs to be done. On the other hand, there's fear that it'll be taken over by insiders who know the game and want to play it better than the other side, and so in this case, they don't take anything apart. So
we're screwed either way.
And well, I'm hoping there's a nice middle ground that they take some things apart and they understand how it works so that they can take it apart, correct? I mean, there's a lot of people in the Trump administration were not sensitive to Trump's goals. And why they were there, I have no idea. But they should never have been there. And I won't name names, but
Because they gave them a lot more money.
no, I don't know. They were supposedly palatable to the Democrats. So they'll go through flying colors with the integration of the Congress. And that's not the way you should name people.
Well, thank you very much.
What you all
Thank you.
think?
Where we put the spotlight on people and companies doing great things for the agricultural industry. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcasting platform, and give us a 5-star review. You can also follow us on YouTube and Rumble to see the video version of Ag Spotlight. Also, head on over to NorthAmericanAg.com to subscribe to our Industry Connect update newsletter. If you're interested in advertising opportunities, email us at connect@NorthAmericanAg.com. Thanks for listening.